The beginning of wisdom is to say, Lord, I'm empty here. I don't know anything. And there, the knowledge is not, what's the quadratic equation? But the knowledge is, I'm in a bad situation, I'm afraid, my family is sick, something terrible has happened, I'm lost.
What is the relationship between age and wisdom? Does wisdom automatically increase as we get older, or is there more to it? With a long tradition of wisdom literature and elderly heroes, the Bible may be the wisest place to look for answers. Christopher Bellitto is by trade a church historian, but he's ventured into the world of Scripture, hoping to uncover a roadmap for our journey. So come along in search of ageless wisdom, lifetime lessons from the Bible, today on Subject Matters. Chris, thanks a lot for being on the show. It's great to have you.
It's nice to be here.
Let's start with the title of your book, Ageless Wisdom. I know this is very intentional because you want to draw our attention to these two elements of age and wisdom. So conceptually speaking, let's start there. How did this whole idea for a book come about?
Well, this is a departure for me. I'm a church historian. I lived most of my life in the Middle Ages, and there came a point where I wanted to kind of expand myself. And being a good Catholic, I had never read the Bible. We don't. And so I wanted to find a way in. And also I think I found that as I was getting older, going through my 40s, I began to lose my mentors, the people who lit my way. And I began to wonder, just from listening to readings, is we all think, we want to think that as we get older, we get wiser. And I found that as I was getting older, I wasn't necessarily getting wiser. So I said, well, let me read the Bible and see what it says, expecting that it will say, as you get older, you get wiser. You're not far into reading the Bible until you realize that it doesn't say that you have old fools. Solomon, of all people, the wise king, ends his life as a fool. And then you have these young characters like Daniel, and everyone says, though he's young, he speaks with the wisdom of the elders. And at that point I panicked because I thought, I don't have a book. What I thought was going to be the case wasn't. And then I decided to embrace the paradox and see where that led me. Now, of course, the Bible is an anthology.
Right.
I'm not a scripture scholar. And the Bible is written by many hands, we believe inspired by God, in many genres, in many contexts, over many centuries. So you can never really say the Bible says about anything.
Right.
But I decided to draw on the wisdom from this book and was delighted to find that even when young people are wise, the language is that they have the wisdom of the elders. For instance, there's a story, and I didn't just use the Bible, I decided to look at stories, how these stories were commented on by Jews, Christians, and Muslims throughout the centuries. And you get stories, for instance, of a very young man, and his name is Eliezer, and he's 18, and he's elected to be president of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. But people aren't listening to him, because some people think he's too young. And he goes to bed one night and he wakes up with white hair. God had given him white hair so that people would listen to him. So we still have that notion that there's something about the gray, don't wash the gray out, that connotes wisdom.
Age in the Bible, though, is really a dominant theme, and I didn't realize that until I read your book. I mean, you can go through the Bible paying attention to all kinds of other things that are going on, but your book really helped me focus on this question of age. And there's some fascinating things, like characters who live for 900 years.
Methuselah, 969 years.
I think Methuselah,
he wins.
He's the oldest. But Adam for I don't know how long, and even Abraham for 100 and something years, 120 or something like that.
Moses, 120.
Yeah. How do we make sense of that? What's going on here? Why are the writers of the Bible giving these outrageously long ages to some characters?
Well, I tell my students that if they ever go on Jeopardy and there's a Bible question, the answer is 3, 7, 40, or 1,000. And 1,000 means a whole heck of a lot of time. And so these obviously are ahistorical, unhistorical things. other literature in the period, from the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians, there's a great Sumerian king list where people live 42,000 years. They reign 18,000 years. So these are just, metaphoric ages. In fact, at one point I wanted to call this book Life Begins at 140. So I think it's just that these are just numbers to say that these people lived a long time, a fullness of life, which is typically 70 years in the Jewish tradition, 60 plus 10. And that during that period of time, there came a point where they grew closer to God and began to get insights from God. But in the 17th century, some people are really trying to be scientific about it. And so they say, people really did live that long until the flood. And then the flood knocked the earth off its axis. And there are these quasi-scientific discussions that years then became longer, 365 days, whereas before that they were shorter. So there are these attempts to make true what are obviously metaphors.
I loved what you said earlier, and that's in your book, that you don't necessarily have to be very old in order to be wise. Very happy to hear that. But when we look at the Bible, when we read the Bible, we do see a really profound respect for older people.
Right.
And I was thinking, especially when you talk about the commandments, respect your father and your mother, respecting your elders.
Which is repeated in the Quran. The Quran talks about reciprocal mercy. That as your elders, your parents, your grandparents, showed mercy to you as a child, as they get older, you show mercy to them. And there's a tribe in Ghana called the Akan tribe, and they have a proverb that says, you must take care of people when they lose their teeth, because they cared for you when you didn't have any. And they call these elders in this tribe living ancestors. It's just a tremendous phrase. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis have all talked about bridging the generation gap. And I think that there's a real lesson here, because demographically something is going to happen in the next couple of decades that has never happened before in recorded history. We've always been younger than we've been older. And by about the year 2040, there are going to be more people on the planet over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. It's never happened before. What are the implications for ministry? I don't think people are talking about that.
I want to ask you about the notion of biblical wisdom. When you read through the Bible, when you were studying this, you were putting this together, we know, for example, that there are wisdom books. Job, right. Psalms, Proverbs, Sirach, these kinds of these books of the Bible. But did you discover or uncover an actual concept for biblical wisdom, or is it very diverse?
Well, it's diverse because of all the different genres as well. But the notion is, I think, is that there's this sense of perspective that comes. When I was young and I grew up, my grandmother grew up, lived in our home. I would say, Graham, why did something happen? It's not for you to know, it's God's time. And I found that very unsatisfying as a young person. But as I get older, I realize that it is not for me to know, and that God has a different sense of time than I do. And what I noticed was common in all of those stories is that I could pull out some lessons, and that's how I organized the book. That I noticed that as people got older, their sense of humor got stronger and sharper. So at the age of 90, again, was she 90? She was very old. Sarah is told that finally she's going to get pregnant. And she laughs. In fact, that's what the word Isaac means in Hebrew. It means she who laughed.
Right.
Well, if you were 90 and found out you were pregnant, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
There's something so kind of human about it. I also noticed that the people who are older tended to bargain with God. Abraham and Moses are two really good examples of this. I think the sense is you don't bargain with God unless you're very comfortable with God. And I think now that I have friends for 30 or 40 years, that there's a comfort level between, we don't even have to speak to each other sometimes, and we know what the other person is thinking. And I think we should strive to have that kind of relationship, that kind of friendship. Patience is another lesson. Many of the wise characters are very patient because they've been through it all, they've seen it all, they've done it all. Another is that physical breakdown is a burden, but it can also be a blessing because it frees the person not to worry about the here and now and to think ahead as well.
We have to take a short break, but when we come back, much more with Chris Bellitto and more ageless wisdom. so don't go anywhere. Christopher Bellitto is a professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey. He's published several books and is also a frequent public speaker and media commentator on church history and contemporary Catholicism. He has an MA and PhD in history from Fordham University and is on the Fulbright Specialist roster. Dr. Bellitto also serves as academic editor-at-large of Paulist Press and series editor-in-chief of Brill's Companions to the Christian Tradition. He lives with his wife Karen and daughter Grace in New Jersey.
To know who you are with no delusions is clearly a step toward wisdom in the ancient world, whether you were a polytheistic pagan or a Hebrew monotheist. This self-awareness reveals a special type of biblical wisdom, since you can only make a good deal when you know what cards you're holding.
Here with Chris Bellitto discussing his book, Ageless Wisdom. And Chris, you point out that wisdom does not necessarily mean factual knowledge in the Bible. This is a really important concept, and I want to quote you here because it's a great line.
Oh dear.
Think of the smartest person you know, now think of the wisest person you know. They probably aren't the same person.
Exactly
and
right.
I thought that is so true.
Well, you know, in the world in which we live, the world of my students, information can be gathered in a split second. Whether or not it's accurate or not is another thing, right? Information is different than knowledge. I can have lots of facts without really having an understanding of what to do with those facts. Otherwise, they're just factoids. Wisdom is beyond that, because you could have all sorts of knowledge and be pretty dopey and make really bad decisions and not have any common sense. It goes back to Socrates when the question is asked of the Delphic oracle, who is the wisest man? And the answer is Socrates. And so Socrates says, why? And the Delphic oracle says, because he knows what he doesn't know. And the beginning of wisdom is to say, Lord, I'm empty here. I don't know anything. And there, the knowledge is not, you know, what's the quadratic equation? But the knowledge is, I'm in a bad situation, I'm afraid, my family is sick, something terrible has happened, I'm lost. And I think it's in that Lent moment, that desert moment, where you really open yourself to God's wisdom, because you're sloughing off this notion that I have a PhD, I have an MD, I'm a CPA, and all of those letters mean nothing when it comes to really big kind of life decisions.
I want to ask you about another theme that we see in the Bible, which is the fear of the Lord. A lot of people know the very famous line from Proverbs. I think it's in chapter 9.
The beginning of wisdom.
That's exactly right. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
What does that mean? Because people think fear and they think, I need to run away from God, who's this big bad judge who's coming to condemn me.
Right.
What's the concept of this,
the
fear in the Lord?
The derivative of that, the Hebrew word fear, is really a sense of awe. It's a sense of your littleness, but not your littleness that I'm unworthy of God. It's a sense that you're human, but there's this bigness of, in the Jewish tradition, Yahweh. And I am small in God's big hands, but that big hand is going to care for me. So there's an essence of humility here. It became very clear as I was writing this book. I often get the idea for my next book when I'm writing a book, and it became very clear that what my next book project is, which is humility, which I'm calling a biography of a lost virtue. And humility is part of that. When you understand, when you know that you don't know, then you're open to something bigger, and that's the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom.
I want to look at a specific example because I know it's very dear to you, and that's the story of Naomi.
Naomi's the star of the book.
She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, and it's a great story. But just take us through the story, first of all, and then explain why Naomi is highlighted or featured as a wise person.
Well, one of the things that I really enjoyed in this book was discovering what I didn't know, having never read the Bible. Abraham gets remarried after Sarah. Who knew? And I wanted to see who emerged that I never heard of before. I never heard of Elihu. I never heard of Barzillai. And I knew the book of Ruth, but the star of the book of Ruth isn't Ruth. The star of the book of Ruth is her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi and Ruth are both widows. And rather famously, people may know the line that Naomi says to Ruth, don't let me wear you down. I'm old, you're young. leave me. And Ruth says, no, wherever you go, I will care for you. It's a beautiful notion of caring for the elderly. So they go to a new place, and some people see Naomi, and they call her by her name, and she says, no, call me Mara. In Hebrew, Mara means bitterness. I mean, she's got, bile in her mouth about her life. But she notices that there's a young man named Boaz, and Boaz has an eye for Ruth. And Naomi goes into Yenta the matchmaker mode. And she tells Ruth, show your interest, but don't be too interested. And Boaz is very attracted to Ruth for, among other reasons, her devotion to Naomi. Ruth and Boaz get married. Ruth and Boaz have Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David, and you continue down the line to Jesus. Now, even though Ruth shows up in Christian scripture in the New Testament, in the genealogy, because of David, you don't get David without Naomi.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story and highlights, the cleverness, the intuition, the savvy, but also the life experience of some of the characters of the Bible really jump out when you break open the stories. We have a guest reviewer today of your book. John M. Sweeney is the executive editor at Ave Maria Press and also a best-selling author himself. John.
I am getting older, and perhaps that's why Ageless Wisdom caught my attention the way it did. I'm about to round the 50-year-old mark, and I often feel that I know a lot more than I once did, but I'm not necessarily wiser, and I'd like to be wiser. So Chris's book caught my attention right away when it arrived for that reason. I will pick just one example of what Chris taught me. There's a bunch of stories in the book, and Chris shows himself to be an expert on the Bible, which I didn't know. Chris, I knew you as a historian, mostly about the papacy. So that was also a delight. But the story of Elihu that he talks about in here. Elihu was one of the friends of Job. There were three friends who were older, and Elihu is the fourth friend, and he's younger. And I had never paid much attention to him in the book of Job. But Elihu's the one who comes along and says, well, does wisdom come with age necessarily? And then he answers his own question and says, no, it doesn't. We could probably trace back the saying, in God's time, to Elihu in the book of Job, because it's a rebuke of Job and his friends. Elihu's statements that he makes, they find it easy to see that health and happiness come from God, but not the ways in which wisdom comes from God. And it could even be that Job's suffering is a way to teach him wisdom, and it turns out that it is. Wisdom is probably the most important of all, more than health and happiness, and it certainly lasts longer, into eternity, I suppose. So we obtain wisdom over time. We come to know God's wisdom the more that we experience in life, and the more that we allow ourselves to experience life with God, in God's grace, in God's time. And all of that plays out in a great sort of Socratic dialogue in the way that Chris tells the story, and I enjoyed that very much. Now, I know I'm supposed to pose you a question, Chris, and I do have a question, because when I started reading the book originally a few months ago, and then I reread it recently, on page 6, you make a statement that I really liked at first for its democratic nature, when you say that the lessons of the Bible are available to anyone and everyone, believer or non-believer. But then as I thought about it more, I thought, wait a minute. The Proverbs I could understand, the stories of the patriarchs, even lessons from the parables that Jesus tells. These are things where we can learn lessons no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, religious tradition or not. However, my question, Chris, is there's got to be wisdom that comes to some, the privileged, the few, who have a relationship with God. There's got to be a wisdom that comes, doesn't it, in knowing God personally.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Chris, is there wisdom that comes from knowing God personally?
Well, let me say thanks to John. I'm a big fan of his work, especially The Pope Who Quit. I think that there is a difference. I think there's a great question that John Sweeney asked, because the Bible, of course, is a cultural text, and you can know the story of Noah without being a believer. But there's wisdom of this world, that you're going through life, it's going to be difficult, you can have a lot of patience, things will work out in the end, maybe they won't, but it kind of will leave you flat. The joy, I think, of being a believer of whatever faith is that there's a promise of an afterlife. There's a promise of something that's going to come later. And we are so involved in our own life. You know the expression, you miss the forest for the trees? Forget that. You know, we're in the weeds all the time, and everything is right in front of us, and we obsess about everything that's right in front of us. And so I want to answer John's question by quoting Pope Francis. So if he finds the answer unsatisfactory, he can complain to Pope Francis. Pope Francis said, "This is wisdom. It is the grace of being able to see everything with the eyes of God." You know, we talk about the view from 35,000 feet. Well, if you're God, your view is a little bit higher than that. And I think it brings to mind that wisdom talks about the long view. And this is why I think it's so critically important to have our younger generation and our older generation connecting with each other. You know, for most of recorded history, people lived and died at home. For most of recorded history, there were intergenerational families. The nuclear family is an anomaly. People say, oh, people go to college and they move back home. You know, there may be reasons that that's not good, but there are lots of reasons why it is good, that my daughter knows who her grandparents are and are involved in that. And those of us who are in a sandwich generation with children below us and grandparents, our parents above us, I think that there's a real richness here. And I think that it's very rare for a child or a parent, an adult, to see with the eyes of God. It's the grandparents' role to see through the eyes of God.
Very interesting. We have to take one more break, but when we come back, some concluding remarks from Chris Bellitto and some more ageless wisdom. Don't go anywhere.
So I decided to dedicate this book to our daughter Grace as a wise soul, as I say in the dedication, because she comes from a line of women with wise souls. Her mother, my wife Karen, and Karen's mother, Catherine. And she carries that wisdom from them moving forward. And so that's how I dedicated a book on wisdom and age to a little girl.
Ageless Wisdom, Lifetime Lessons from the Bible is published by Paulist Press and is available for purchase at paulistpress.com and at Ben McNally Books in Toronto.
Maybe we need to consider older age not so much as a time for slowing down as for speeding up. It's a life stage when the elderly can reap the rewards of past efforts precisely in order to branch out into new endeavors. Reaping always sounds passive. Things come to you. But it can also be an active process.
Chris, we often think about when you get older, you know, you spend your life sowing and then it's time to reap. But you kind of turn this around in the book, and it's a very interesting biblical theme, but a concept that you break down for us. So explain that for us.
Yeah, at the end of the book I say that there's a time to reap and a time to sow. And I think that one of the gifts of wisdom is that once you get it, you should give it away, right? So the theme, I think as a teacher, that the theme of my life should be that I should die empty. I should give everything that I learn away to my students. And I find that in the older people in my life, that they're empty when they die because they've given it all away. They've reaped the fruits of their learning and the fruits of their knowledge, and they don't take it to the grave with them. They sow it to the generation and the generation after them. And so their wisdom will live on. So there's a cyclical nature to wisdom, that it doesn't live unless it's shared.
I want to ask you kind of a contemporary question. We have a Synod of Bishops coming up in October of 2018 on youth, faith, and vocational discernment. Now, when you think about a Synod of Bishops, you typically think of old men sitting in a room, especially bishops, you know, talking about all these different issues. Well, they're going to be talking about youth. And I was thinking, you know, because you wrote this book, if you were to hypothetically sit in that room and address, you know, the world's bishops, these old men, about youth today, knowing what you know and what you've studied, what do you think you'd say to them?
Well, if you want to, you know, finagle an invitation for me to go to Rome, I'd be happy to do that. Well, I think, first off, we don't need a room of old men to tell young people how to live. And so I think that the Synod of Bishops needs to be massively reconfigured to include women, women religious and lay women, and married men as well, and people who come from broken families. Widows and widowers, and also single-parent households. And I would like to see those men listen to those ordained men, listen to those married or divorced or widowed men and women, to talk about what they learned in their experiences. And what I'd like to see is better directives from those bishops to seminarians on getting some better stuff from the pulpit out on the riches of the Bible and the richness and the messiness of family life. Francis has a great line, reality is superior to ideas. And when I hear sermons, and luckily I've got wonderful sermons in my parish, but when I hear sermons about this is the rule and this is the way it's supposed to be, I just turn off, because I feel that this person doesn't know how gray my life is. So I hope that synod is an opportunity to, we've got too many walls between generations. We need to build bridges between the generations. And that is the legacy of John Paul II and Benedict, who wrote some beautiful things on bridging the generations. And Francis loves to tell young people, I'm going to give you homework. He literally says homework. Go home and talk to your grandparents.
I have one final question for you. We're running out of time, so it has to be quick. But in the foreword of the book, you mentioned that you conceived this book about 10 years ago.
Right.
But circumstances wouldn't let you write it. But I'm wondering, now that you have written it, do you think the book is different now than it would have been if you wrote it 10 years ago?
Yeah, I really do. In the last 10 years, going through the same thing that everyone else goes through in their 40s, I think the older I get, the more I realize what I don't know. And I think that opened me up to trying to listen to the Bible, as opposed to going in and saying, for instance, well, when you get old, you must get wise, and that's the book. And so in many ways, the book taught me about age and wisdom in the Bible, hence the title, Ageless Wisdom.
Chris Bellitto, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
The book is Ageless Wisdom, Lifetime Lessons from the Bible by Christopher Bellitto. You can get it right here at Ben McNally Books in downtown Toronto. You can also get it online from Paulist Press. Just visit paulistpress.com. Chris is professor of history at Kane University in Union, New Jersey. You can follow him on Twitter at Dr. C. Bellitto. He also has a personal website with all of his books and articles, but it's a little complicated, so just Google his name and it will pop up. I want to thank our guest reviewer, John M. Sweeney. John is executive editor at Ave Maria Press and a best-selling author. His latest book is The Enthusiast, How the Best Friend of Francis of Assisi Almost Destroyed What He Started. And you can follow John on Twitter at John M. Sweeney. And remember, if you'd like to see my video review of Ageless Wisdom, visit our website, saltandlighttv.org/subjectmatters, and click on the episode page with Chris. That's all the time we have for today, but thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Subject Matters with Sebastian Gomes is sponsored by the Cullen family. Our Salt and Light team works hard to bring you quality Catholic programming like Subject Matters. Please consider supporting our media ministry by making a donation today. Thank you for your generosity, and remember, our hope begins with you.